Aloha and welcome to this screencast where I want to go through the way data is initialized, data and users are initialized in this particular template. So as you know, when you bring up this system, you can see there's already some stuff in the system: bananas, boogie boards, and baskets and bicycles. And there's also users that are predefined in the system. So there's an admin at foo.com and there's a John at foo.com that you can log in as. And as you bring up the system, if you're looking at the console window, you can see the first time you bring up the system, you'll see that there are these log lines printed out saying creating the default users. Creating user admin at foo.com, John at foo, creating default data, and then you're seeing these things being added. Okay, now one thing that's kind of interesting is this only happens the first time you run the system. So let's say we do meteor npm run start one more time. What you're going to see is that these default users and data are not created the second time. Okay, so here we go. The app starts up. We don't get those lines being printed out. And the reason being, as you'll see in a second, is because we check the contents of the database when we start up the system, and we only add those default users and items in the event that the database is empty or those items don't already exist. Okay, and just as a third thing, let's say you wanted to start over totally from scratch. When you're doing development, you do this meteor reset command. That empties out the items in the database, and then if you do the meteor npm run start again, you're back to the initial state where you're going to have those default users defined again. Okay, so that's the basic behavior that I want to talk about in this screencast. Is how is it that when the system starts up, it defines these default users? Okay, and so to answer that, we're going to go and start looking at the code. Now, as you recall, in Meteor, there are two, under kind of default application structure situations, there are two directories that have special meaning in Meteor. There's a server directory and a client directory, and their meaning is special in the sense that if there's a main.js in the client directory, that code is going to be run on each time a client starts up. Okay, that code is going to be run, and that's kind of the entry point into the system. And you've got to make sure that once that code is run, that the client user interface is set up. Okay, it's for every single client. Then, because this is a client-server system, you have a bunch of clients but just one server. So each time the system starts up, the code in the server directory in the file called main.js, that code is run by default. Okay, and that's the code that you put code in there to run to set up the server in any way you want. And in this case, the thing we're particularly interested in is that the establishment of that default data and default initialization. Now, I will say in the current versions of Meteor, you can override this behavior so that you can load code from other places. But this is what comes by default, and it works pretty well. Okay. The other thing that is kind of at this point more of a convention and a best practice than something you strictly have to observe all the time. Which is to say that the contents of the client and server directories are fairly minimal in terms of just doing these import statements for starting things up. Your actual application code, by convention in Meteor, is put into a directory called imports, and you, by convention, kind of split it up into at least three subdirectories, one where you have your data model, one where you have the code that you run on startup, and then the code that establishes the user interface. And there could be other ones as well, but those are the three primary ones. Okay, so what we want to focus on, since we're talking about data initialization, and since data initialization occurs on the server side, what I'm going to spend this video talking about is what happens when the Meteor application starts up, which therefore means that on the server side, this main.js file is going to be loaded, and what happens then. Okay, and what happens then is we're going to start off and we're going to import a file called import startup server accounts, which is located right here. Okay, so let's see what this this file does. And what it does is it defines a function called createUser, which we'll see in a second. But then it has this code that says if meteor.users.find.count equals 0. Okay, so meteor.users is a predefined object in the system which exists on the server side. And so what this code says is, are there any users in the system? And if there aren't any users in the system, then what we're going to do is we're going to define some default users. Okay, so how do we do that? All right, we're going to next refer to this object called meteor.settings. Okay, so what is that? Well, Meteor has this idea of a settings file, and that enables you to declare a file in JSON format that provides settings, configuration information for the system, and that's what we're going to use to find out what are the default accounts that we want to establish. Okay, so how does the settings file get set? Well, in the package.json file, you can define scripts, and so this template application, meteor-application-template-react, defines a script called start, and the start command expands into the following: Meteor no release check. That just means it doesn't, each time you run Meteor, it doesn't go out to the server to see if there's a new release of Meteor, which kind of makes things go a little faster. But then the most important thing, there's a parameter called ---- settings and a file specification. Okay, so you notice that when I always, by default, when you run these systems, you always invoke the system like this. You don't just say Meteor, okay, because if you just say Meteor, you're not telling Meteor where your settings file is. Okay, so instead we're going to say Meteor npm run start, which is telling Meteor to look in package.json for a script called start, which is here, which means that the actual command that will be run is this one, and which means that this meteor.settings object is going to be bound to the JSON file that is in the file specified on the command line, which turns out to be in config settings.development.json. And this is what this file looks like. So it's a JSON file, so it's an object. It's got two fields, one called default accounts, one called default data, and then inside, and these things are bound to an array, which has some objects in it. The objects providing the data that is going to be used to initialize the system. A quick note, never good to have passwords in clear text. For the purpose of this class, where I'm mostly focused on, well, I'm totally focused on your ability to build prototypes, okay, for which you can get user feedback to make sure that your functionality and user experience is appropriate. We're going to gloss over some things which I guarantee Meteor has can take care of these things, but to make the velocity of your development faster, we're going to cut a few corners with respect to kind of what a professional app would have to implement. A professional app would not have passwords in plain text, but it just makes your development life easier in these initial stages of development to not worry about these accounts and not put into place the production level constraints on what can be shown to the user in clear text. Okay, so anyway, that caveat aside, let's finally go back to accounts.js. So now we know that the first time you run the system, this will definitely be equal to 0 because there won't be any users established by default. And so therefore, we're next going to check to see if meteor.settings is bound and has this default accounts objects in it. And if there isn't, if you kind of messed up in your settings.development.json and didn't have a default accounts, then or you didn't specify the meteor.settings variable, then there's going to be this else clause that says, cannot initialize the database, please invoke Meteor with a settings file. But, in the normal case where you run my script Meteor npm run start, you'll get this creating the default users, and then, which we can see right here, creating the default users. And then what we're going to do is we're going to map over the elements of this default accounts array. So here's our default accounts array, and whoops, sorry. And we're going to take that object element, we're going to destructure it into 3 variables, and we're going to call this create user function with email, password, and role. So now we finally call this function for each of those objects in the default accounts field. And so we'll say create user, and we'll show the email address, and then we'll call this built-in accounts function in the Meteor package called create user, passing the username, email, and password. You can see both username and email are bound to the same object. So your username for this system is the same as your email. And then if in addition there is a role field associated with that account, then you can add that user to the admin role, where roles is this package from the called meteor/alanine::roles, which is a standard package in Meteor used for providing roles for users. Okay, and it makes it easy to add roles, define roles, check for a particular role membership, and so forth. All right, so that's what happens. So let's get kind of review. Right, on startup, we Meteor invokes this loads this main.js file. That meant that we imported the accounts package. That meant that we checked to see if users check to see if users was 0, and if they are, then we set up these default users by invoking this create user. The second time we run the system, if the database already has some users in it, then this of course will not be true, and we don't do any of that code. Okay, that's why the second time I ran it, we didn't get any messages out. All right, so that's, whoops, doggone it. So that's that one. The next one we want to load is publications. I'll get to this in a little more detail in a future screencast, but what we also want to do on the server side is define publications, and Meteor has this publication and subscription-based mechanism for allowing clients to communicate with data from the server. It also has the more conventional kind of RPC style of database access, but this pub/sub stuff is kind of cool and makes it quite easy actually to manipulate the database. So what we're going to do here is we're going to define 2 publications on the server side. One called stuff, which will just publish the data associated with that particular user to the client who subscribes to this. And then there's also another publication called stuff admin. And the idea of this one is that if a client tries to subscribe to this publication, that user needs to be an admin. And if they are, then we're going to return the entire contents of the stuff database to the clients for their manipulation. So that's the publications. Let's go back to main.js and see our third one is we're going to load the Mongo file. And here, what we're going to do is something very similar to what we did with users, except this time we're going to do it for the data. So we check to see if our stuffs collection has any data inside it, and if not, we're going to basically run through the same process, meteor.settings.default_data. We're going to check to see if there's a default data field in the settings file, and here's our default data field, and you can see we've got an array with a bunch of objects in it that represent different stuff things, and then going back to here, so then we'll say creating default data, and we'll map through the objects in the default data array in our settings file, and we're going to invoke the add data function with each of these objects. And so we print out a line saying adding this data, and then we call stuff's insert. Okay, so I think that's pretty straightforward, right? This it runs on the server side, so we're updating this collection with this data, and you can see this is what results from doing that line. All right, that's pretty much it for data initialization in the Meteor application template React system.